Will the Committee of Supply please come to order? Before we begin, I have a leave request for this section of Committee of Supply. Our long-standing practice is for the opposition to sit at the committee table to the right hand of the chairperson. Because the minister is participating virtually this morning, I am asking if there is leave of the committee to waive this practice. This would make it much easier for the members of the opposition to see the screens that are situated in the room. Is there leave?
Agreed. Agreed.
Agreed and so ordered. This section of Committee of Supply will now consider the estimates of the Department of Enabling Appropriations. Does the Honourable Minister have an opening statement?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Just a brief.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just a brief opening statement. It's an honour to be part of presenting a budget. Obviously, it's a very crucial time in the Manitoba, not just Manitoba economy, but probably over the last, I'll say, century in terms of protecting Manitobans and also providing supports that are in place in this critical and historic time with everything's going on with COVID-19. And so we're here to talk a little bit about the enabling appropriations. And so we're very proud of the fact that our plan really is to protect Manitobans and advance Manitoba in so many different ways. We are prepared and ready to address any additional waves, as we're obviously deep into the third wave. And so we're hopeful that with the vaccine program that's in place, that we won't go into a fourth wave, but this budget really protects Manitobans. Our COVID plan really protects Manitobans in health, education, and supports for individuals as well as businesses. And we will really do what it takes to protect Manitobans at this point. We want to make sure Manitobans are supported, not just on a health basis, but also supported so many different ways from businesses and supports. We've stockpiled PPE, vaccine testing sites are up and running, obviously, and more are coming online. As I believe there's upwards of 9 right now, and other sites. And but clearly we're not out of the woods yet with COVID-19. And what this budget does, the enabling appropriations, it makes sure that we're ready, we're prepared. We're spending more on COVID-19 supports, more than most other provinces in terms of Ontario and Alberta and Saskatchewan on a per capita basis from the provinces that we've recently tabled. And so we do think this is a good plan going forward. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll wait for your comments and any questions from committee members.
We thank the Minister for those comments. Does the critic from the official opposition have an opening statement?
No, we do not.
Before I open the floor for questions, I'd like to inform the Minister and the critic that when you have 1 minute of speaking time remaining, I will hold this sign up for 10 seconds so that you know that you have a minute left. The floor is now open. Sorry. Does the committee wish to proceed through the estimates of this department chronologically or have a global discussion? The member for Fort Garry. Could you turn, you seem to be muted because we can't hear you. Is your...
Yeah, global, please.
Global?
Yes.
Thank you. It is agreed that questioning for this department will proceed in a global manner with all resolutions to be passed once questioning is concluded. The floor is now open for questions. The member for Fort Garry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm wondering if the Minister can sort of direct his attention to page 152 of the estimates of expenditure book. What I'm hoping to do with the enabling appropriation section is basically to go systematically line by line through the estimates. And so I'd like to start at page 152, Part A, operating 26.1, enabling vote. I'm wondering if the minister can just expand what's the purpose of this line item and what's being included in it.
The Honorable Minister of Finance, if you could raise your hand when you're ready. The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Chair, 1 second. Sorry, my hand signals aren't as good as they should be. So just conveying, and I will indicate when I'm ready to speak, if that's okay with you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. The Honorable Minister of Finance, did you raise your hand that you wish the floor now?
Can you not hear me?
No, sorry, we didn't. Like, you have to give me your hand signal so that I could recognize you so that we could hear you. The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Okay, can you hear me now, Mr. Chair?
Yes, you're coming in clear. Thank you.
All right, okay, good. Thank you very much. I'll raise my hand from now on. It's like school. Anyways, 26-1, enabling vote. So funding is allocated from the enabling vote to the department program appropriation, where the costs are incurred. Actual expenditures are not typically reflected under the appropriation. So obviously there's $100,000 for Canada-Manitoba Framework Agreement on treaty land entitlements, other expenditures. This obviously is delivered through Indigenous and Northern relations. It represents the activities related to negotiations, coordination, and implementation of treaty land entitlements, agreements, and other settlement agreements, expenditures related to administration and coordination of TLE, Memorandum of Understanding, and compensation to municipalities for tax losses. Over the past few years, the department has been able to accommodate these expenditures from within existing resources and has not sought an allocation from enabling vote. However, the amount continues to be budgeted, so it is available for the department to require. So this is something kind of an ongoing, something that's been in the budget for a number of years, and they have incorporated that in their line departments for the future. So that's the first item.
The member for Fort Garry. Could the member from Fort Garry please turn his mic? Like, I can't hear you. Are you muted right now?
Yeah, I believe the moderator is muting me, given that we're in committee and I'm going to be speaking quite regularly. Perhaps the moderator could govern themselves accordingly. That's going to be rather awkward if I have to constantly unmute. My question to the minister is under item B, International Development Program Grant Assistance. I'm wondering if he can explain what is that program and what is the $1.2 million going to? What type of grants are being given there and to whom?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So the International Development Program allocated $1.2 million. So this has been kind of in the budget, I think most years. I don't think the number has changed. So since 1975, the government of Manitoba has provided an annual grant to the Manitoba Council for International Cooperation, known as the Manitoba Government Matching Grant Program. MCIC, which is the acronym, uses the funding to leverage grants from other levels of government and international aid organizations to support a variety of international development projects worldwide, Mr. Chair. The MCIC is a coalition of 39 member organizations involved in international development and relief work. MCIC is a coordinating body for the Manitoba-based organizations active in international development, peace, and social justice. MCIC promotes public awareness of international issues, fosters members' interactions, and administers funds for international development. The grants are distributed by the MCIC through 4 funds: the Development Fund, which makes up about 80%, the Theme Fund, which is about 4%, the Community Solidarity Fund, 6%, and the Relief and Rehabilitation Fund, 10%. Grants address a wide range of issues such as education, literacy, job creation, agriculture, environment, micro enterprise, business development, and health. Projects are delivered by the Manitoba organizations and their partners abroad.
The member for Fort Garry.
The next heading there is immigration projects grant assistance. And there's been a significant reduction, almost 45% in that heading. So I'm wondering if the minister can explain what is that immigration projects, why would it be under this heading, and why has it been cut almost in half from the previous year?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Hi, Mr. Chair. Thank you. And so the next item is the international immigration projects. The authority to notionally allocate the immigration-related projects in the Department of Advanced Education, Skills, and Immigration, Economic Development, and Jobs. So the member asked about, I guess, the difference in the budgeting. So there's a 3.936 year-over-year decrease in the amount allocated. And it's due to a $3 million grant to settlement services, which are now being funded through the federal labor force agreements. So it's funded, same amount of money is going, it's just funded through the labor force agreements.
The member for Fort Garry.
If we could turn now to 26.2, internal service adjustments. Again, we have a very large line item at A, 1.18000 of COVID response expenditures. And I'm wondering if the minister could spend some time to provide some more detail there and break down the allocations of those numbers.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so the numbers are breaking down. Yes, there's absolutely a big increase in this area. So this is related to COVID expenditures for the most part. There's some other moving pieces here, but it's about 1.1 billion. And so this is something we announced just before the budget. Really, it's made up of a number of different sectors. First, around $230 million for COVID kind of response. These are kind of carryover items, I guess, if you will, commitments we've made. Health system costs. So that's about $350 million. What we wanted to make sure, at least that time, we fully prepared for a third wave and potentially a fourth wave. And so this is costs that may be associated through COVID types of relief that's in place or health cost systems to the system. We also have additional PPE vaccine sites for $100 million. So this pays for, again, like the vaccine site rollouts, Of course, the federal government is paying for all the vaccines, of course, but there's a number of costs. For the most part, we've front-ended a lot of these, like the cost maybe for the super center at the convention center and other areas like that. So we've entered a number of lease agreements. Staffing, I think, makes up a good portion of this. I think somewhere's up to under $40 million of this for staffing. But as you can see, with a $100 million budget, there's a lot of money that's available for that. We also identified $160 million for K through 12 for Safe Restart funding agreements for $160 million. This is a Safe Restart capital for about $40 million. So that was part of the plan to get the economy moving again. And then we also put $300 million in contingency. Thank goodness we did, as we're going through the third wave. And so, of course, we've had to allocate some monies from these types of areas for things like extension of the bridge grant program, tune of around $71 million, sick leave program, it could be upwards of $60 million, and some other smaller programs for restaurants and others that would be part of it. It's also made up of kind of surgical procedure backlogs for about $50 million. So that makes up the bulk of the money for this particular area.
The member for Fort Garry.
So the 230 million for COVID response, you indicated that was from prior commitments announced before the budget. Has that money all been spent?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so this is a carryover of items through COVID that we made expenditures and made commitments to. The 230 is made up of things like test site leases, right? So we've got leases at the Convention Center and Brandon Keystone Center, places like Leela, the soccer complex, I'm not using the right name for that. And there's been a number of other sites that have opened up. I believe Gimli, if I'm not mistaken, is opening up today or will be opening up soon. And other areas that the Minister of Health could get into more details of the numbers and all that sorts. But essentially testing sites, the leases that would be part of it for the vaccine site leasing. So there's the testing site leases and the vaccine site leases, other vaccine costs, contact tracing, and things like PPE.
The member for Fort Garry.
So how much of that allocated money has not been spent to date then?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. We, of course, are just, kind of 2 months into the year, so we will be giving a comprehensive update in Q1. What we did last year, and I think probably, although we landed on it, but I think it makes some sense, is to provide kind of a COVID expenditure updates throughout the quarters that we'll commit to doing. We think that makes a lot of sense, and that will kind of highlight, kind of where we are year to date. For the areas. There is some fixed costs. We do anticipate testing site leases, for the most part, probably going to cost us $5 million, give or take. Vaccine site leases, again, $7 million. Things like visitation shelters is part of that. So that was part of the areas in personal care homes, right? So that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 35. Those are 35 million. That's some examples of it. But at the end of the day, we will be providing a comprehensive spending document that will categorize where we're at in the Q1 report.
The member for Fort Garry.
The next category you broke down is $350 million for health system costs for the third wave and for a potential fourth wave. So I'm wondering if you could break down of that $350 million, how much has actually been spent on this third wave, how much is being budgeted for the third wave, and what's going to be left over for a potential, and hopefully we don't need it, fourth wave.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
I like this approach, Mr. Chair. I feel like you're the headmaster to school here, or I'm answering some questions. So, in any event, so the way the budgeting works, because we obviously introduced the budget in April, and then what happens is it reports back from the departments kind of like after the month happens, and that's how we kind of consolidate it for the most part. So we really only have 1 month of data. Now, our hope and what we had planned for in the budget is to make sure we're prepared for a third or fourth wave, and that's why we put so much money in here compared to other jurisdictions in terms of COVID supports. But we do anticipate with the wave of where we're at with the first month or so, is that we should be on track with what we had allocated, the $350 million in the first quarter. But quite frankly, until we get more information back in terms of the expenditures, we know that we've been hit a lot harder in May than we have in April, and we don't have those numbers consolidated back from health. But there is a lot of moving pieces that does happen in the budget process, and especially during the pandemic. And so, what we do is we consolidate the numbers, and we're committed to, have a full out understanding of where the money's being spent after the first quarter. So to be fair, we are tracking where we thought we would, and that will provide enough money to provide supports. And even if we didn't have enough money, our government is committed to spend what it takes to protect Manitobans.
The member for Fort Garry.
It's good to hear that the government actually put a plan in place for the third and maybe, regrettably, fourth wave. So I'm wondering, of that 350, how much has been allocated for the third wave, and how much has been allocated for the fourth wave?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Yeah, I'm going to refer you back to my previous statement. Again, as indicated, we allocated $350 million. We believe we're tracking on track with that number. We'll have a better indication after Q1, but to be fair, we've got over 1 month of data, and there's obviously more expenditures in May, but I can tell you that we'll have a more fulsome response to that when Q1 report does come out, and we're committed to identifying our COVID expenditures. But we are on track to spend that $350 million.
The member for Fort Garry.
When the minister indicates we're on track to spend that $350 million, that's through the course of an entire year. Is that correct? It's not through the course of the third wave. Do I have that accurate? That he's anticipating leaving a chunk of that money not spent on the third wave?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
No, that's not at all what I said.
The member for Fort Garry.
Well, then I'd ask the minister to clarify his comments and make it clear to the committee, is that $350 million budgeted for an entire year, or is it budgeted for this third wave? And will he spend the entirety of the $350 million battling the third wave, or does he have a portion of it that's set aside for potentially a fourth wave or something that could happen in December of 2021?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Yeah, I don't know what to say to you. I've answered the question twice to you. So we've allocated $350 million. It's more than any other provinces have allocated for COVID types of expenditures. And so this will, we believe, will protect Manitobans, ensuring that supports are there. You do have to remember, too, that we already have things like a year's supply of things like PPE that are on hand. And so there's some costs that you won't have that you had last year. That's a part of it. But the $350 million is allocated to support the third and potentially, hopefully this doesn't happen, a fourth wave. So again, we've got 1 month of data that's there. And so we're tracking on track with that expenditure.
Okay.
The member for Fort Garry.
So the minister said that they're on track with what they've allocated. So clearly they've set aside a portion of that $350 million for the third wave. So I'm wondering if he can tell us what has been allocated for that third wave. Where are they in their tracking? Because they say they're on target. And how much is left within what they're allocating for the third wave after that?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I mean, I've answered this question 3 times for the member. I'm not sure what he doesn't understand about it, but clearly there's a lack of understanding. So I'm just going to refer him back to my my statement 2 answers ago.
No.
The member for Fort Garry.
With the greatest respect, the minister hasn't answered my question. He's dodged it several times. He absolutely understands what I'm asking him, and he's basically told this committee that they're not spending the entire $350 million on the third wave, and that they're apportioning it, and he's refusing to answer how much they're apportioning. And that's his right, but I wish he would just be straightforward with the committee and say, yeah, you're not going to release that information at this time, instead of dancing around and playing games with this. So I'd ask this minister, are you going to answer this question, or are you going to refuse to give that information to the committee?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm going to have to repeat the answer for a 4th time. What our government has committed to doing is in the first quarter, we'll release all our expenditures where we're tracking to date. I think that's pretty open and transparent to provide all the information similar to what we did in the midterm review. And, we can go through that as well, that identified what the costs were. In fact, in the budget document in the third quarter, there's further tracking. If you look on one of the pages here and the fiscal responsibility outcomes and economic growth strategy, on one of the pages where identified what we had spent last year. So we're very much open to providing the support. I can tell you, we have had a month worth of expenditures for April that have been reported into the system, and we're on track to have enough money in that $350 million to support it. But at the end of the day, our government is committed to supporting the healthcare system as much as it needs right now. And so if there'd be need for additional money or to move money, then we absolutely would do that. So there shouldn't be any concerns for the member. And again, our government is open and transparent. And so and the first quarter report comes out, we'll provide all the expenditure costs breakouts, and the member will have all the information that's needed.
Okay.
The member for Fort Garry.
So I guess this minister has admitted that they haven't spent the $350 million on the healthcare system. Given that we are in a crisis right now, given that the hospitals are overrun, the ICUs are full, that we're shipping patients out of the province, that we're having massive staffing shortages, why isn't more money being put into the system right now to combat the third wave? What is the minister waiting for, and how much money is he withholding that he could be putting into the medical system right now that he's choosing not to?
Honorable Minister of Finance. I'll refer the member to my previous statements. We've put $1.1 billion of support that's in place. That's higher than the vast majority of all provinces in terms of their supports that are in place. Any money that is needed to support Manitobans during the pandemic, we're committed to supporting. And if the member has some sort of request that I somehow don't know of from a Treasury Board level that's been blocked, I'd be very surprised. But any responses, any money that's needed in the system from our level, there isn't an issue. We need to do what it takes to support Manitobans, and that's why we put so much money in the healthcare system. You've got over $350 million supports that are there. You've got $230 million of things like PPE and everything else that we relied on that avenue. We've got over $300 million for contingency. You've got $100 million for vaccine sites. So I haven't heard from any healthcare professionals that somehow money isn't being allocated to address the crisis, the COVID crisis that's in place.
The member for Fort Garry.
So since we have gone into this sort of critical level in the last few weeks, I'm wondering if the minister confirmed that the health department or health ministry has not made any additional requests for funding over and above what was already planned for the third wave, that you haven't received any additional requests, no additional money has been put into the system that wasn't already planned to be there, despite the significance of the third wave.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
No, that's not right at all. Well, first of all, just to unpack things, we have allocated, just on the core budget alone, $156 million more to the healthcare field. In fact, since coming to office, we've allocated about $750 million more to health than the former NDP government ever did. But we have allocated $1.1 billion for COVID expenditures. So what happens from a government process is anytime there's a needed approach, there's delegated authority through the chair, through Treasury Board and other members to expend money. So every week there will be items that come back to our Treasury Board to make decisions on COVID expenditures. So, and what happens is we've allocated a big amount of money, the 350 and other monies, 1.1 really when you look at all their avenues. So as the expenditures come up, we allocate those dollars and we approve those dollars going forward.
The member for Fort Garry.
Since we've hit the critical level and been in the full sort of throttle of the third wave, has there been additional requests by the Ministry of Health over and above what was normally planned for this time of year prior to us getting hit by the third wave?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so what happens from a budgeting point of view, number one, there's the core budget that every department has, of course. So they're allocated that money. That's the estimates process, of course. And so we approve that. So budget. So for instance, the health budget between $6 to $7 billion right now. We've kind of made a different department for mental health and addiction. So I think there's 350 some odd million dollars that are there. So departments are able to spend those monies because they've been allocated and approved. And so what we have allocated above and beyond that is COVID expenditures, the 1.1 billion. And so we've gone through and through some of my press conferences and stuff, we've identified what we put as costs that are associated with it. So these are monies that we've approved Now, there may be a technical process where, the actual cost comes back and we have to approve it. But until you expend the 1.1 billion that we've allocated under the ISA, there would be no need to have another budget appropriation that's in place, because we have money to fund those appropriations either through the line departments, whether it be health or education or social services, whatever they are, also through the COVID expenditures. And so we broke down the COVID expenditures. So, there's $1.1 billion. So, until you've allocated that full amount of 1.1 billion, there isn't a need to appropriate additional monies. But if there would, then we would work with your party and obviously the Liberal Party to appropriate more money. We did that in the last budget, right? There was 2 or 3 different budget bills. One came back because there was some dollars that the federal government appropriated to us for, passing on to municipalities, 106 million and other types of initiatives. There was additional monies for COVID because we tabled the budget before the pandemic hit. So, to be fair to the member, we've allocated the 1.1 billion. Until we've used that up, there isn't a need for additional appropriations. They can come and they get approval to expend this. In fact, we've given delegated authority to some of our officials to expend that money, and then it comes back.
The member for Fort Garry.
All right. So given what the minister has just said, there is a large portion of the 350 million that hasn't been spent yet. And his comments is that when they're tracking it, it's where they expected it to be. Why hasn't it spiked? Why hasn't there been more requests for more resources during the third wave, and that it's just been constant and it's where you expected it to be? Nobody could have predicted the impact financially 3 or 4 weeks ago. And so if nothing has changed in the ministry's plan, that is very indicative that there really hasn't been any unusual or exceptional expenses being drawn upon it by the health department. So I'm wondering if you can explain that.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. And again, I'll maybe explain it one more time to the member. I know he's a new member, so sometimes it's difficult to do all your homework at once and make sure you understand the processes. And government is obviously it's important to make sure you understand the processes. But what happens is, again, we allocate money through the budget process. Those go to the departments. They're able to spend their dollars once it's appropriated through the budget. We've appropriated, $1.1 billion in COVID expenditures. So that money is there. That's a commitment from our government and to spend those monies. And as the bills come in, that's how we pay it, through the $1.1 billion of expenditures that are in place. So, I'm not sure what more I can add to the discussion now. We've allocated a good amount of money, more than other provinces. We're paying the costs as they come in, as the bills come in. We estimate throughout the year, right? You don't know how much you might have to spend on security or what have you for some of these super sites, or maybe staffing levels go up or down. So at the beginning of the year, you figure out what we think will be cost, and for the most part, you base it on what our officials are telling us and what we spent last year on these things, how much PPE you might need, right? And taking the fact that we have a year supply of some of these items that's in place. So that's, when you do your budget, you do your best guess estimate of what the dollars and cents are. They've got authority to spend this beyond the $7 billion they have in their budgets, which now through some of the budget changes we made, they're able to move their monies around a little bit more for it. So they have authority to spend it. The way the Treasury Board and the government system works, whether it be under the NDP government or Conservative government, is the money has been appropriated in those areas, and they're able to come back when these expenditures, when the bills are due, and then we approve them from there. So until you get above and beyond the 1.1 billion for COVID expenditures, I can't tell you what's going to happen in the fall. My hope, and I'm sure the members' hope, is that we're through this third wave, and so that the costs go down, and that there isn't a fourth wave, but there may be some additional costs. You might have to, look at, other areas, not just in health, but in other areas where you might need more supports. Maybe there's more supports for people coming out of this, right? The business supports or whatever, to make sure the economy is charged. But, our government is really committed to two things. Number one is protecting Manitobans to providing the supports that are in place. And we do think that the amount of money that we've allocated here, the 1.1 billion, knowing that it's more than pretty much every other province, is the appropriate amount of money. And my commitment as the Minister of Finance is if there's more money needed to support and protect Manitobans, we're going to do everything we take. And with the help of the opposition parties, if there would be additional need for additional appropriations, we certainly would be bringing it as quickly as we can to the House. But until that $1.1 billion of expenditures is fully allocated, there isn't a need because the money is there. They've got the ability to spend that money.
The member for Fort Garry.
I see in 27.1 of the budget, the emergency expenditures, 100 million has been set aside. Has any of that money been spent this year at all?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the $100 million is an appropriations amount that's allocated for really emergencies. And so the category is broad, but for the most part in previous years, that goes for things like floods or forest fires. We know obviously this is a bit of a drier year, but we were fortunate to get a bit of rain last week, which is a good thing. But to directly answer the member's question, no money has been spent of that as of yet. But as we track throughout the year, that's $100 million of additional expenditures that we could tap into if need be for a variety of things, not just COVID, but it could be for floods and forest fires. So no, none of that money has been tapped into so far.
The member for Fort Garry.
I'm wondering if the minister can give us an update about the rainy day fund and where it sits currently, and whether there's any plans to use it to fund hospitals and schools at this time.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And as you may recall, at one point, the rainy day fund was allocated for around $800 million. Unfortunately, it had been drained by the NDP government to, I think it was about $110 million when we first came to office. And so with some of the pre-work, and thank goodness we did some of this pre-work, we were able to build up the allocations to around $800 million, over $800 million. Because of the mistakes made by the NDP government. And so at year end, and that's when we generally tend to access the rainy day fund, we did access it for the support for the bridge grant program, and there was just over $200 million. And I believe there's about $585 million that will be allocated left in the rainy day fund. What we want to make sure, and I want to be clear about this, the rainy day fund, there's a lot of talk in the media with this. What this is, it's a fund within our existing system. And the advantages of this, for instance, is you don't want to drain it all because there's fires and floods and everything else that happens in Manitoba. So you don't want to be totally drained from it. But we were able to tap into it to support businesses. We're very proud of that. And in fact, the ability to tap into just over $200 and some odd million for the bridge grant program actually saved us money because we didn't have to go to the capital markets and to borrow that money because it's money that was on hand. Right. And so I think we were able to save, millions of dollars by not going to the capital market over a 20-year period. That's a part of it. But I want to be perfectly clear, whatever is in the rainy day fund has no implications on the deficit number. Now, it did back in the day, I guess, when the governments mainly went from a core, we used to call core and summary budget. So the counting of that has changed based off what the Auditor General wanted us to do, to move to a summary basis because it's more of a more of a transparent way of, identifying, how much money you have in your system, not just in the core government, let's say but also kind of the crowns. And so, again, I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that the amount of money that you're taking in and out of the rainy day fund has any implications on the deficit number, but it is cash on it, like it is real money in an account that you can use to address issues, which we did in the last, not public accounts, I guess it was through our year-end budgeting process that allowed us not to go to the capital markets. There was some savings to governments in that respect. And that is something that, and we did release this on March 30th, so there is a press release that talks about $215 million to protect local businesses. So if you do have some discussions with, people like the bond rating agencies, they very much like the fact that we were able to rebuild the rainy day fund and that you have cash in hand. And I can give you a real life example. I've kind of said this a few times, and there has been a huge pickup in the media, but I think it's really important. Back in March, and I'm on calls with the finance ministers across the nation really weekly. Now it's gone down to biweekly, but at that point it was really weekly, almost daily contacts with all the ministers of finance and Minister Morneau at that point. And there was a scary time in March where provincial, we call sub-sovereigns, couldn't access the capital markets, or the spreads were just so impossible that we were weeks, I'd say weeks away from not being able to pay our bills, quite frankly, being able to pay our obligations as a government. Now that cleared up, and thank goodness it did. And there's some help with the federal government in terms of some programs, buying T-bills rather, and long-term bonds that helped. And our premier actually took a leadership role in that too, because he really convinced the federal government to backstop us, I guess you will, because they can borrow money cheaper than us. But my point is, there was a time in March that we couldn't access the capital markets. And so having $800 million on hand really protected us, because if we would not be able to pay our obligations or pay our staff because we couldn't access the capital markets, that would have been a horrible situation. And so that's why it's important to have a lot of money on hand. And also, I guess if you just look from my press release on March 30th, what is important is that dipping the rainy day fund will keep Manitoba borrowing from going to the capital markets, saved about $45 million in interest costs based on what interest rates would be. Now, interest rates are lower now, which is good, but governments can borrow money in a better way. But above and beyond, having this ability to pay, if there isn't an ability to pay, which is critically important and is very much supported by bond rating agencies, we save taxpayers $45 million because we didn't have to go to the capital markets by dipping into the rainy day fund.
The member for Fort Garry.
The minister indicated that there was also $300 million contingency fund out of this internal service adjustment. How much has been spent on that $300 million to date?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, it's really important to have contingency during the pandemic. We've kind of seen, one thing that can be expected with the pandemic is you got to, it's a moving target. I mean, sometimes the items that you think are going to happen or things that you think may happen don't, and so it's really important to prepare. And so above and beyond, I guess incorporated in the $1.1 billion was $300 million of contingency. And so that really provides an opportunity for different initiatives that are funded. Not all these are funded through that same mechanism, but I'll give you maybe a couple examples. What we heard is, across the country, that because of the federal sick leave program, for instance, we needed to have some sort of sick leave program because there was kind of a week lag before employees could access that federal program. And so we brought in a program, it could be upwards of $60 million that will support individuals. And it's the longest kind of sick leave program in the country, about 5 days other provinces like NDP, BC were 3 days, and Ontario were 3 days. And so ours is the longest duration. Long story short, I mean, programs like that, and I guess the second program that I would mention is the Bridge Grant Program. We knew going into the budget process that we had to be prepared. And so the $300 million allowed us to prepare for different initiatives. And so we've did another appropriation for a Bridge Grant Program, which I believe, and I think I've got close to the right numbers here, so I'll just might as well give them to the member here. You know, the Bridge Grant Program is in the neighborhood of $71 million. So every time you allocate that, I think there's about 15,000 businesses that have been supported. All totaled, you know, we've allocated about $671 million to business support programs. That's like the bridge programs, the GAP programs, you know, pandemic sick relief, all these items. So long story short, we've used the contingency will be used for these types of initiatives when they're needed. We've talked a lot about having the right programs at the right time, and so those allow us the flexibility because of our planning for a second and third wave to address issues like that.
The member for Fort Garry.
So how much of that 300 million has actually been spent?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So, you know, I guess, you know, quick math just says really about $71 million from the Bridge Grant Program and upwards of $60 million for the pandemic relief type of program. Now, again, it really depends on how many people access that program, but we've allocated a good amount of money. We're encouraging people to use it. We think it's good for employers and employees. There is also smaller amounts for a top up to the restaurant program at $3.5 million. Now that kind of came from a different line, I guess, in our budget where we're budgeting for it. So those are the two allocations so far.
The member for Fort Garry.
The minister had indicated that 671 million was allocated for business support programs. How much has actually been spent?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll get the member to turn to the budget document on fiscal responsibility, outcomes, and economic growth strategy on page 45. So it does identify, and these are the supports for businesses. Now, again, this is the third quarter report for last year, so other additional dollars and some of it, and I'll go through kind of what we've allocated this year. But of that, as you can see from the page 45, there's been $430 million as of the third quarter. Now, this takes into consideration Bridge Grant, the GAP program, the long-term relief fund, the back to work, and identifies our commitments and our expenditures that's related to it. Some of these are ongoing expenditures. So that's in the third quarter. And then just the two other expenditures, we spent a lot more, but the other two expenditures, major ones, I guess I would say, is additional allocation of $71 million for the Bridge Grant that I just had identified, and then up to $60 million for the sick leave program that's above and beyond that. So that's how we came up with the 671 that incorporates the third quarter reports and the dollars that we've identified this year.
The member for Fort Garry.
So of the 60 million that you're allocating for the sick leave program, how much has actually been spent?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chair. And so the sick leave program went live, I guess, 2 weeks ago. So I don't have the numbers here. We can find out what they would be, coming forward. It really depends on how many businesses apply for it and how many people are sick, for the most part. I would also talk about the bridge program. The money did flow. The $71 million did flow to businesses. We didn't have them, kind of reapply or anything else. It just, if you got the bridge grant program before, you got the money in your bank account, and I believe they got it over the last week and a half or so.
The member for Fort Garry.
The lockdown restrictions have been extended now for at least another week. And the First Minister calls them the toughest in Canada, and it's hurting certain sectors of the small business community who are again closed for yet another week. Will there be additional compensation for those businesses to be closed? And when will you be announcing them, and in what form will that compensation be?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Yes, Mr. Chair. So thank you for the question. So we have allocated, as I mentioned already this year, to small businesses $71 million. The money did flow about a week and a half ago. So there is money in people's bank accounts they're from the business sector. We also introduced over the last 2 weeks another program for the paid sick leave program, and then also a bridge top-up grant that was to restaurants. And that was in the tune of $33.6 million. So that was because the restrictions came on kind of around the May long weekend, not May long weekend, I guess it's Mother's Day. And so a lot of restaurants had a lot of inventory. And so we thought that providing a bit of a top up there made some sense. We allocated that. And then of course there was another commitment, I believe it's $2 million for, it's a program, a rebate program for delivery. So it's kind of like skip the dishes and that sort. We basically pay the costs of that. So that's money we've allocated already. We obviously have money available, and we do pride ourselves on doing programs at the right time in the right place. So yeah, there will be some potential future programs that are there. I do also want to have the member recognize that we had a number of dollars that are in the budget for things like job incentive, wage incentives. So for instance, we know that youth have been hit pretty hard during the pandemic. So we allocated about $25 million to wage support programs. Now I think, when you look at these things with the pandemic, when you're in a complete shutdown mode, probably programs like the bridge program makes a lot more sense. The wage kind of subsidy types of programs probably will make more sense later on in summer when businesses reopen and they trying to hire their staff back. So it's kind of a balanced approach to providing support, $671 million so far. And then the money that we've identified already this year with some of the wage support programs that are in place. And also I would suggest that, some of the supports that we did for businesses, so things like cutting the payroll tax is something that the business community has talked about for a very long time. And so we've taken pride in the fact that over the last 2 years, we've increased the thresholds. And so there's been kind of thousands of businesses that haven't, have either not having to pay the business or rather the payroll tax, or kind of moved up the threshold, I guess, if you will. And so they're not paying as much, as well as other targeted tax measures for digital tax measures. The film industry, how important that is here. And so we did some other changes, as well as some other tax measures to lure some digital players, right? Ubisoft is one, obviously. There's some different content and stuff like that that will make them more viable here, as well as other things like the education property tax that's going to benefit mainly residents, but also businesses at a 10% rebate. So we've done a number of those types of things to support businesses. And as the situation arises and we go forward, you know, for the Bridge Grant Program, I think this is our fourth, what I'll call tranche. So if there's a need to do more, you know, what we have done to this pandemic is really, you know, over kind of on a monthly basis, we've kind of looked at this. If there's further restrictions that happen, we would consider it. But the $71 million for the Bridge Grant Program just flowed about 2 weeks ago.
The member for Fort Garry.
In relation to the bridge grant and the fourth tranche, to use your words, you simply just gave payments to, I guess, those businesses that have already benefited from the program. But we're hearing from small businesses that new businesses have been barred from applying for the bridge grant. And I'm wondering if you can explain why we're not allowing new businesses to apply, and that only assistance is flowing to those that have currently been accepted to prior tranches for the program.
The Honourable Minister of Finance. Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. So we really taken pride in the fact that our programs have been flexible. We've made a number of changes throughout the course of a variety of these programs, whether it be the GAP program or the Bridge, of the types of businesses that can support. They've been easy to access, right? I mean, just the fact that we were able to allocate another round of payments for the Bridge Grant Program. We were able to announce it, and we were able to get it in people's bank accounts because they need money right off the bat. So we were able to do it kind of an ease basis. We've been flexible in terms of the changes we've needed made, you know, and other items. So we're always evaluating what makes sense, what businesses need support, and where they're, you know, where there's support in place. I think if you look at every level of government, they would probably say, at least you talk to my colleagues, Minister of Finances across the country, and I think it's generally been known that there's been some sectors that have been dramatically impacted, right? The accommodation services, the tourism, restaurants, bars. I mean, these are areas where people cohabitate. You know, the cultural sector, you know, and sports facilities, these types of things. They've all been impacted because, you know, more people go to their facilities, and so you know, having probably some of these global programs where all sectors get money as opposed to more of a targeted approach. I think most finance ministers would say we need to use more of a target approach. And so that's what we've tried to do here. And one thing I can say, from last summer, we went through the first wave and the economy started kicking back in. I think we lost somewhere just under 100,000 jobs. And so some of the programs that we had in place, the wage subsidy programs, you know, seem to work quite well. But again, I think there's a difference between when you're in a lockdown like we are now versus, you know, when you're in the rebound. And so we're going to evaluate these things. And if there's a need, we've taken pride in the fact that we provide some flexibility with changes to the right programs, the right time.
The member for Fort Garry.
So why have you barred new small businesses from applying for the grants? Why isn't the government going to recognize their sacrifices and their difficulties?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so I guess I point out a few things. Number one, as the third wave and probably the biggest of the lockdown, which happened, I guess, a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago now, you know, we want to make sure people got the money quickly. And so what we did is we extended that out, you know, so people that had applied, and just for the record, you know, we've had, I think, upwards of 70,000 individual payments. There's about 125,000 businesses in the province, Manitoba. So of the $671 million of money that's flowed out to businesses to support them during the pandemic, you know, we provided, you know, 70,000 individual payments to 120. So I'll let you do the math on that, but there's a good portion of businesses that did get support there, and the Bridge Grant Program in and itself supported upwards of 15,000 businesses. So somehow to say that we weren't catching a wide net of businesses that were supported, and the fact that we continuously listened to the business community and others and saying this group or that group should be supported. We made some pretty important changes to the programs as we move forward. So we're always going to listen to that. We're always going to have an ear to listening to the business community and others that are impacted by the pandemic. And so I'm going to say nothing is off the table.
The member for Fort Garry.
That this was intentional, that he intentionally excluded new businesses from being able to apply for the grant. I'm wondering how he can justify that. What's the policy reasons for not providing support to new businesses? And will he commit today to changing that and allowing new businesses to apply for the grant?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Yeah, Mr. Chair. No, the member's completely wrong. I didn't say that at all. In fact, that's what he said. That's his words, not mine. What I said to the member is we've allocated $670 million to businesses to support them. I've said that all along we've had a flexible program. We've had a program that's easy to access and broad-based program for the most part. Now we're being a bit more specific with some of the wage subsidies that will happen probably later on in summer. So no, I didn't say that at all. That was the member saying it.
The member for Fort Garry.
That's good to hear. So will the minister commit today to opening up the Bridge Grant Program to new businesses? And if he won't, why not?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Yeah, we're always committed to listening to the business community and making sure that the program's the right programs, the right time. I do think that, when we allocated the other $71 million to 15,000 businesses that got a fourth round of the payments for the Bridge program, we want to make sure they got the money quickly in their pockets. If there's sectors of businesses that that somehow weren't supported, we're always going to take a look at that. Now, to be fair, the program has been open for quite a long time. I think we initially established this in November-ish. And so it has been open for 5-6 months, right? And, or rather, so 5, 6, somewhere around there. So it's a good amount of time for businesses to be supported. And so we're always going to monitor what makes sense. And so if there's other sectors that didn't apply in that first 4 or 5 month period, we're certainly will take a look at that.
The member for Fort Garry.
Wondering if the minister can tell the committee how many Manitoba businesses have closed in the past year.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry for the delay. We have a report from insolvency bankruptcy businesses. Now, this is pulled from Stats Canada and is incorporated to the Manitoba Bureau of Statistics. So, we can get you the information, what pages these are on. For the most part, in 2020, there was 28 businesses that filed for insolvency bankruptcy. Now, and so far, it looks like in year to date, there's been 3. Now, this seems, the numbers seem very low here, but what I guess I would suggest, and we can get some further information from our departments on that, that's Stats Canada and bankers. There isn't a requirement for businesses that maybe just shut their doors, right, to report into Stats Canada that we relay in our Manitoba Bureau of Statistics. So, I can tell you that globally that I know businesses that have been impacted, and really the sectors that have been hurting the most, I think are things like restaurants, things like hotels, things like accommodation services or tourism, things like, where people have to come out and help out, or rather come as a kind of a group setting that's there. So we can provide that information from Stats Canada to the member. I can tell you during the pandemic, we lost about 90,000 jobs overall. So those are the people that were laid off. Now, about a good portion of that has come back. Now, there's obviously been some probably layoffs and that sort that have happened since the pandemic has happened. But the latest stats was, I believe, over about 10,000 people of that 90,000 are still unemployed, which is far too many. So those are kind of the areas, the information that we have. Again, there isn't a requirement for businesses to register in those areas, but certainly those are the sectors that would be hurt.
The member for Fort Garry.
Well, the province would have business registration information, and the province would also have tax information. And obviously, you would know how many businesses stopped paying taxes and stopped being registered as businesses in Manitoba. So I suspect you have that information. I'm just wondering if you can share that with the committee.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I apologize for the time. I just want to make sure I'm getting the right information. So just to kind of circle back with the numbers that I quoted before. So this is prepared by the Manitoba Bureau of Statistics, adapted from the Industry Canada. So that's Stats Canada. And this was produced on April 15, 2021. So those are the latest stats that we have. And it talks about territories, including other in Canada. So this talks about the insolvency piece. But to directly answer the member's question, there isn't a requirement, like let's say someone has a business number, for instance, there isn't a requirement for them to report back to the government or that issues the business number that they've gone bankrupt or whatever kind of business structuring that they have in place. So we don't have that. Now, we do have a program, and I can, our officials are just looking for this right now. There is a number of businesses that applied, like we've allowed them to say, if you need to defer your PST remittance or some of the other tax that are in place if you're kind of a bit of a smaller business. So we can provide those information of businesses that have asked for those deferrals. We had that last year, and of course we extended it out this year. So again, to answer the questions, there isn't a requirement for businesses to call to the business registry, right? I guess, and say, I'm going to close up my business number. And that does make some sense, right? Even let's say you decide to close your doors as a business, you may be in different, you may not, the first thing you may do is necessarily to cancel your business number. So there isn't really a requirement to report back to the provincial government in respect to that.
The member for Fort Garry.
Now, the minister earlier had said that in relation to the bridge grant, if it needed, more to be done, that they would consider it. And he prefaced that with if there was further restrictions. Well, there has been further restrictions, and the small business community is calling for more to be done because they have widely, through their professional bodies, have indicated that the supports that have been in place so far have been inadequate and not enough. So given that the lockdown restrictions for some businesses have been extended, will the government commit to another new tranche of the grant program? And if not, why?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Yes, Mr. Chair. So what we had, the money has flown right from the third, I don't call it a tranche, but third amount of money that's been flowed to, or fourth payment, I guess, to businesses, the 15,000 businesses, about a week and a half ago, or 2 weeks at the very latest. So the restrictions that are in place are pretty much kind of, there's been some changes to them, but for the most part, they were status quo from what has been in place for the last 2 weeks. So we will evaluate for sure. And my sense is there would be some more supports to be in place, but knowing the fact that in the course of when we've had to use the bridge grant program, for the most part, we've flowed the money, 30 days out or so. It's almost on a monthly basis. We're only 2 weeks really into the global restrictions that are in place. So we will evaluate that. I believe the next health orders last until June 12th, if I'm not mistaken, right around June 12th. So we will evaluate. And again, if there's a need, we hear from the business community. I don't necessarily have heard those concerns, quite frankly, from the business community. I mean, there certainly have been very good at lobbying for their members. But, I think there has been a lot of support for programs like the Bridge program and the GAP program and some of the wage incentive programs. And I think that some of the tax measures were very much supported in the business community. If you're getting rid of or enhancing the payroll taxes, I think that's very much supported. There's about 1,000 businesses that don't have to pay the payroll taxes. There's kind of support programs for the digital economy and all that sorts that would be part of it. There's $50 million that went out to the Chamber of Commerce for some long-term strategies. That's to enhance kind of their e-commerce kind of platform. So back to my direct answer to you is we're going to evaluate this, but really the money flowed about a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago. So we will evaluate that. Hopefully doesn't have to be any further lockdowns. So, it looks like the numbers, at least this week, have seemed to plateaued. So our hope is, of course, that the numbers, will go down. I think they're actually a little bit down from what they were about a week ago or so, but I haven't seen the numbers today. So That's a long-winded answer of saying we'll evaluate it, but the money has just flowed over the last 2 weeks for the bridge last payment.
The member for Fort Garry.
So if I'm hearing the minister correctly, it's the time of the extension, that it's only a week, that if it was a month, then the government would more seriously consider it, but it's too short of an extension period, and that's the concern for the government?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
No, that's not at all what I've said.
The member for Fort Garry.
That's in fact exactly what you said. So why isn't the minister, if that's not what he said, committed to giving more support, given that the lockdown restrictions have been extended for a month? And why does he keep saying, well, the checks just went out, and normally, we do this on a monthly basis? So how does he reconcile those very contradictory statements?
The Minister of Finance.
No, it's not contradictory. It's you that's trying to make it contradictory. What I clearly have said is our programs are broad-based. They've been flexible.
I'd like to interrupt. Whenever referring to the word "you" should not be used, it should be the member's constituency or title. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
That's not at all what I said. What I said is that our programs are very broad-based. They're flexible, and it's the right programs at the right times. We flowed over $671 million so far to support businesses. We provided a number of programs that provide flexibility for businesses, and we will be evaluating, as we go forward. So we have money, obviously, through contingencies to address this. We're very proud of the fact that over the last week and a half, 2 weeks, that 15,000 businesses have got another $5,000. And so we'll evaluate as we go forward. Our hope is that there won't be any restrictions. In fact, they'll be loosening them, but that really depends on the numbers and what our health officials, like Dr. Rusin, are advising us to do in terms of the health measures.
The member for Fort Garry.
Now, you had indicated that in this...
I would like to, if I just mentioned that, if all comments could come through the chair, direct, like "you" should not be used. It should be the minister or the member, or direct it through the chair, but the word "you" should not be used. The member for Fort Garry.
My apologies, Mr. Chair. The minister had indicated earlier that $160 million was set aside for COVID-related education expenses for K-12 system. I believe in the House we heard from a FIPA a request that there's about 107 million roughly has been spent on that. There's roughly about 70 million left in that. I'm wondering if he can confirm those numbers, that there's about 70 million left of that original 160 million, or if I have that wrong, what's the actual number?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Yes, Mr. Chair. So yes, I believe the numbers that the minister had indicated are accurate. I'll get the member to refer to a press release actually yesterday that talks about the province provides protection and additional millions of dollars for safe schools. So it identifies, $58 million for new funding for 2021-22 to ensure continued pandemic protection for schools towards resources. And then it kind of identifies investments over the next school year. It'll be $40 million for per pupil allocations for school divisions and independent schools, $6 million for potential costs for PPE, $5 million for kindergarten to grade 8 remote learning support center for students, $7 million for contingency, including $5 million recovery learning. Kind of goes on to talk about some of the programs. And I think the initial question was, for the current school year, the province is projecting to invest about $170 million by the end of June.
The member for Fort Garry.
So we heard that there's, something like 60, 70 million that hasn't been spent. There's a few weeks of school left. Why hasn't that money been spent? And is there a commitment that all that money will go to the schools prior to the end of June 30th, 2021?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I believe the commitment was 186, 185, 186, right around that ballpark figure. And of that money, what the divisions, or rather what the Education Department is suggesting by the end of June, that $170 million that will be spent.
The member for Fort Garry.
Now, because of Bill 28, many school divisions proceeded as if it was law and didn't fairly bargain with the teachers and other collective agreements in their world. Now that's all blown up, and school boards are on the hook for 4 years of back pay and interest. And this is blowing $20–30 million holes in some of their budgets. It's leading to, it was reported in the paper today, 130 teacher layoffs at the Winnipeg School Division. I know Pembina Trails, another one of my school divisions, doesn't have the money to hire 19 teachers for the 350 new students that they have this year because they have to catch up and pay this money. Now, this government has prevented school boards from raising that money from property taxes. And this government's also cut funding to schools. So this government's created these holes. So given that, will this minister take responsibility for the problems that he's created and ensure that no school division is going to be caught short for funding as a result of this, and that the Winnipeg School Division and Pembina Trails in particular, and others as well, will have those costs paid so that they can make sure that 150 teachers aren't laid off this year?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chair. And obviously that's discussions that the minister and our departments will be having with each of the individual school departments, school divisions rather, in terms of that. Obviously, that's an important area. We know that some divisions have had better luck at not raising taxes. I know, Mr. Chair, when the member for Fort Garry was part of the Winnipeg School Division, really did focus in on tax and spend types of policies. And in fact, just looking at some of the increases they had year after year, here in 2012, and this, Mr. Chair, is obviously one of the poorest school divisions that are around, with a lot of needs that are there, but the tax increases been jacked up on individuals in the Winnipeg School Division. In 2012, there was a 7.8% increase. Goodness gracious. 2013, there was a 6.8% increase in school taxes. 2014, there's a 3.6% increase. And in 2015, there was a 3.2% increase. So sometimes it's easy, for politicians to take the lazy way out and, just go to the taxpayers and jack up taxes. That's not something our government is really focusing on. We're focusing on cutting taxes. And so that's why we've done things like reducing the education property tax of 25% reduction this year and 25% next year for 50% reduction. I know the member for Fort Garry thinks that everyone, all those 650,000 homeowners are wealthy. That doesn't really seem to be kind of a message. If I go in my local community, St. James, which is Kirkfield Park, which is kind of an average community, if I said to them, you're a property owner, you're one of the 650,000 property owners, and you must be wealthy because the member Fort Garry says you are, they're going to look at me and they're going to, say, this is just crazy talk. Providing, suggesting that everyone who's a property tax owner in the province of Manitoba is wealthy because you own property is just completely not something that they would agree with.
The member for Fort Garry.
Losing 130 teachers in one school division, 20 in a much smaller school division is devastating. It's Calgary type education where there's 47 kids in a classroom. And this minister believes that's the way Manitoba should head. It's shameful. I'm embarrassed for him for his last comments that he wants to brag about wealthy tax cuts when his government has basically put our education system in crisis. Shame on him. Shame on this government. I'd like to stand behind him when he has those conversations with the parents in his riding and what they think about the cuts to their schools. School trustees protect the education system. No school trustee ever wants to raise taxes, and they only have raised taxes because there's been 5 years of end-to-end cuts to the education system by this minister and this government. They have now put the education system in crisis by blowing a huge hole in education budgets. They have what we're hearing about $1 billion sitting in the bank. Will this minister commit today to paying back the school boards the money that they took with this whole Bill 28 wage theft debacle?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Well, this is where the two parties have a big disagreement. The member thinks that everyone owns property in the province of Manitoba is wealthy. That's just something that doesn't fly. And quite frankly, I guess it'll be a big, when the next election comes, having that sort of message where he walks around telling you, yeah, you must be wealthy because you own properties is something I guess he'll have to decide whether that makes sense to talk about or not. But the member also talks about somehow our cuts and that somehow we force the school divisions to increase taxes. Well, I'm looking at his record, and the reality is, Madam Speaker, that he was lazy and he decided, that it was easier to jack up taxes on some of the lowest income individuals. This is before we came to office. In 2012, the member who was chair at the point, who, the Professor Weens has talked about his out of control nature in terms of his approach when he was chair of the Winnipeg School Division, increased taxes by 7.8%. That was under NDP government. And then in 2013, he decided that wasn't enough. So he decided to jack up taxes 6.8% on some of the lowest income individuals in the province. And then he decided that wasn't enough as well. So it was easier just to go to the taxpayers and jack up taxes in 2014 by 3.6%. And then in 2015, he decided to increase it by another 3.2%. So I'm not sure if that's the track record the member is bringing to the legislature. I guess people will have probably this decision point probably in the next election. Do they want someone that decides to jack up taxes like the member from Fort Garry does? Is that what you're going to bring to the provincial economy? Do you think that's something that's going to help the provincial economy by that increase in some of the lowest income individuals? But that's his track record, and so I guess he'll have to live with that. Our commitment in terms of education actually this year went up by over $91 million. And in fact, we committed to $1.6 billion of new expenditures And overall, our expenditures on education systems got up by over $560 million each and every year, more than what the NDP had spent.
The member for Fort Garry.
Will this minister commit to providing money to every school division, including the Winnipeg School Division and Pembina Trails, to replace the 130 teachers they're going to have to lay off because of cuts and underfunding by this government? And if he won't replace that money, how many kids does he believe they should pack into a classroom? Because they're going to be well over 30 in some schools. So I'm wondering if he can tell us how many kids one teacher should be teaching in a public school in Manitoba.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And our government is very proud of the fact that we've increased education funding by $560 million. In fact, I think we're second or third in the country on a per capita basis in terms of education expenditures. We're very proud of that. We wanted to make sure that we're making important investments in the education system. And so that's why we've committed to $1.6 billion of operating and capital expenditures. That includes this year $260 million in capital expenditures to get 20 new schools built. That didn't happen under the NDP government. They just decided that I guess there wasn't a need for education. We made historical commitments in terms of funding for education, in terms of operating and capital. We're committed to that. We've followed through with what our commitments are as a government. And to answer the member's direct point, the Minister of Education will obviously have discussions with each of these school divisions as it relates to that. Obviously, there's been some arbitrary awards that have been awarded. That's part of it. But we think that making $260 million of commitments on capital schools that should have been funded a long time ago under your former government is an important investment. We think that more money should be spent at the classroom, whether you could put $40 million more in the classroom than spending it on things like junkets for school division trustees. I think you were one that enjoyed wintering in Texas at some of these conferences. And, I just don't think that's a good use of taxpayer dollars. And so we want to make these investments to support individuals and students.
The member for Fort Garry.
Now, in 2020, 2021, the Pallister government budgeted over $221 million in internal service adjustments. I'm wondering if you can tell me how much of that $221 million was actually spent.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I didn't fully hear.
The member for Fort Garry.
Certainly. This year, your internal service adjustments is $1,303,000 and some. The previous year, it was $221,550,000. What portion of that was actually spent from last year, the 2021 budget?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and that will come out in public accounts in September.
The member for Fort Garry.
Now, the IDEA Fund had about $25 million budgeted in 2019-2020, and about $50 million in 2020-2021. And I'm wondering if the minister can tell us how much of it was actually spent in each of those respective years.
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Yeah, we're looking at our public accounts. I got some of our officials looking at it. I'm not sure if we can provide the information now. We did allocate dollars. So the premise of the program was to, look at some long-term costs. So there's ways to saving. I think it's a return on investment. It's 3 or 4 times what your investment would be make. So maybe to like modernize some equipment or something that would allow, better technology to save money in the long run. So we wanted to make sure in some of these times that departments were kind of still thinking long-term with these things. And so if they're able to make some long-term investments, there is some money available for them above and beyond what there'd be normally in their budget to, make these investments. And so what they would do is we put out a call to these departments and they would come back with ideas. And then through our Treasury Board process, we would kind of say, oh yeah, that's a good information that's there. Just being handed something right now. So I'll maybe go through this. This is actually from our budget document for fiscal responsibility outcomes and economic growth. It's on page 94. So it talks about some of the ISA Idea Fund programs. And so it's in the top of the page. So since the start of the program, 34 programs have been completed with an average return on investment of 247%. Ongoing Idea Fund projects are expected to generate an average return on investment of 134%. Altogether, the project's average return on investment for completed and ongoing projects is 148%, with a total net savings to the government of 73.4 million on investments of 49.7. So we invested 49.7 on, some are technology projects and some would, just they've got to make sure there's a long-term savings. And so of the 49 or almost $50 million money that we spent, we saved about $73 million. The member could be going here, so maybe I'll go here first. We didn't allocate anything under the education, the Teachers Idea Fund this year. It will come out in public accounts. And that's just because everything that was going on with the pandemic, it wasn't something that was utilized because of the nature of the pandemic. And obviously the focal point on, remote learning and everything that had to go on in the education system, like everything else in the pandemic this year.
The member for Fort Garry.
The minister mentions the Learning Fund. 2 million was budgeted both for 2019-2020 year and 2020-2021. So how much had been spent out of that allocation in either year?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, turning to the Learning Fund. So just so everyone on the committee is aware of it, the Learning Fund was established in 2019-20 to support additional training opportunities for public servants to ensure that they had the skills they needed to meet the needs of Manitobans. In 2020-21, the Learning Fund received over 620 applications, 483 individuals, and 137 group applications. 87% of these applications were approved for a total investment of nearly $900,000 in over 3,300 public servants.
The member for Fort Garry.
Okay, so there was less than 50% of the money spent that year. How about the previous year? Was the 2 million spent, or was it undersubscribed?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
I apologize about that. Could I get the question again? Sorry, Mr. Chair.
The member for Fort Garry.
The minister had indicated that the Learning Fund spent $900,000 off of a $2 million budget. So obviously it's less than 50% of the money allocated was actually spent. And I'm wondering if he can tell us the previous year, there was also an allocation of $2 million. Was it also undersubscribed? Did it also not get close to that $2 million that was actually budgeted?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. We are endeavoring to find out the previous year, how much was spent. So our officials are looking for that right now. I may have an answer back before the end of our session today, or I could probably provide that. I know we're going to different sections on probably Monday and Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken, if I'm still in committee of supply. And so we can endeavor to get that information to you at that point.
The member for Fort Garry.
Now, given the Learning Fund is about education, why was it included in internal service adjustments? Why wasn't it just simply put as a part of the envelope for the education budget?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so we have it in ISA kind of centralized because this is something that all government employees are able to take advantage of. And so what happens on a routine basis is each department or departments that want to utilize the program can come back through Treasury Board and get the appropriations at that point. So it's not just a Department of Education initiative, it's kind of a whole government approach. And so that's really why we had it housed in ISA. And so, I've gone through some of the numbers of the types of, applicants and the amount of civil servants that have accessed the program. And so it's easier to do it centrally.
The member for Fort Garry.
The Canada-Manitoba Home and Community Care and Health and Addiction Servicing Fund Agreement, it's gone up in funding this year. I'm wondering if you could explain what is that funding agreement, and if you could explain the increase.
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And yeah, the Canada-Manitoba Home and Community Care Mental Health and Addiction Services, in September 2018, the province entered into a 5-year bilateral agreement with Health Canada to receive $182 million in revenues related to home and community care and mental health and addictions. The appropriation provides the expenditure authority, which is shared between several departments related to the federal funding received through the bilateral agreement. The Departments of Families, Education, Justice, Health and Seniors, Mental Health, Wellness and Recovery can request allocations based on approved expenditures aligned with the federal and provincial health priorities. And this kind of just leads into, very proud of the fact that as a government, we were, I think, one of the first jurisdictions to establish kind of a own ministry for mental health and wellness recovery. That's a part of it. We're very proud of the fact that all that, I guess on a kind of a yearly basis, although it's a bilateral agreement over a number of years, that $23 million, we know that we've been allocated, and it'll come out public accounts, but we had spent all that money. And, who knows, there could be some potential for some additional supports. That's a part of it. The budget, for instance, we actually put an additional $5 million for Minister Gordon to go out and do some consultations in the community. And she will be making some announcements, I'm sure, in the next number of weeks and longer in terms of, what additional supports that are there. But we're happy that we're able to allocate that full amount of money, and it'll be identified in public accounts. And because we know one thing we've heard, and we know from the pandemic, if you look at the suicide rates and mental health and addictions, people are having anxiety and are stressed, specifically because of the pandemic. So we're using all that money and more.
The member for Fort Garry.
The government fund remediation, first of all, what is that? I wonder if you could explain that. And then there's been a significant reduction in money from last year to this year, down from 92 million to 6.8. So I'm wondering if you could explain that.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So budget 2020 included about $92.8 million in ISA to the one-time funding to remediate specific or special funds. So 16 special funds were remediated in 2020-21, and authority to remediate 2 funds were carried over in 2021. The 2 special funds remediated in 2021-22 are abandoned reserve fund and quarry rehabilitation funds. So basically what this was because of the accounting of this. If monies are taken in through some sort of fee or levy or whatever the deal is, they would normally go into this fund, and then they would be allocated for different purposes. And each of the fund had kind of different, kind of allocations and how they made the decisions of how that money, once it's brought in, would be flowed. The problem that we saw was that the money would be brought into the fund, and then because of the accounting, PSAS kind of accounting standards, you couldn't carry through the money into the future year. So when government was looking at it as a core basis, like you were able to account for different, but the accounting rules have changed. So even though you may bring in, I'm just giving you an example, $30 million for some particular fund, if you don't spend all that money in the current year, then it lapses, okay? So, we as a government were bringing in a whole bunch of money, and it was sitting in an account, but if it wasn't spent by year end, then it would lapse. And I don't think that was really the fault of any of the departments. It just was an accounting kind of change, I guess, if you will. So what we actually did is we said, we're going to get rid of these funds, but we're going to put it actually in the line departments. So you'll see in all these line departments, money that we actually thought we would spend that year. So, whatever the fund may be, I forget how many there was, but there's a lot of these types of funds. 16 funds, unless they spent it, like we would say, well, what are you going to spend this year? They say $5 million. So we would actually put it in print. So that was a change in the last budget that we did. It was put into print, and then there was some money that was left over in ISA for the departments to come back and say, how are we going to utilize the rest of that money? Otherwise, it lapses. So it was kind of an accounting thing that had to be done, and it made some sense, and also provides some reassurance the way people like appropriated or way people access the programs really didn't change. And you can ask each of the individual departments of how they may have had the application process. I'm not as familiar with each of the funds and how they did that, but essentially that process didn't change for any of the stakeholders that would access the groups. It just now it's in print, it's in the year, what we actually think is going to spend. And the rest of that money was housed in ISA, and departments would come back and they would identify a way to spend that money. So that's the change.
The member for Fort Garry.
The post-secondary job market alignment office, I'm wondering if you could explain sort of what the purpose and mandate of that office is. And it appears for the last couple of years, it's been about $3 million allocation. How much has that been spent out of the budget for the 2020-2021 fiscal year?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so the item was carried forward from 2020-21, signaled the government's intention to spend in this area. Obviously, with the pandemic that was happening, we became aware of the labor force needs that were in place for our workers. And so we were able to establish pretty substantial agreement, labor force and workforce agreements fund with the federal government. So I think it was in the tune of $47 million, if I'm not mistaken. And so that would fund different initiatives. The labor force agreement was more towards maybe getting people out of EIA or getting people like maybe kids in care, providing some supports and training and stuff like that so they could enter into the workforce. And the other piece was the workforce agreements. Those are areas where there may be a need for not just always bigger corporations, but businesses to access training and aspects. And so we've been able to work with the federal government to allocate about $47 million. So this work is ongoing with that department, and that will be one of the functions as we continue to invest this additional 47 some odd million dollars. I'll clarify that number of what the actual agreement was, but I believe it was 47 to 43 million, somewhere right around there for these types of initiatives. But that will be a leading indicator helping to address making sure that our labor force needs in Manitoba meet, kind of the demand of the economy.
The member for Fort Garry.
How many people work in this office, and basically what is it that they do?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is ongoing work that will happen, obviously, with the pandemic that happened last year. We wanted to make sure that there are supports in place. And so the agreement that we had established last year with the federal government, some money was spent through the labor force and workforce agreements. Again, I think it was, I'm going to say 47 million. If I'm wrong, I'm sure my officials will let me know by the end of the session. I believe off the top of my head, there was about 16 to 18 million dollars, somewhere around there, was established. So this office will work in that capacity, to make sure that the labor force needs, whether they're people coming out of maybe EIA or kids in care, those types of programming is in place, as well as kind of labor force needs. So if Manitoba needs, for instance, some sort of labor force, we're making sure that people are trained appropriately. So this office will be set up to address these, kind of coordinate this approach with the post-secondary education, as well as the federal officials, as well as the minister and the ministries of economic development and jobs.
The member for Fort Garry.
So this office isn't running, it's not operational, there doesn't have staff. And if that's the case, when will it be staffed up and when will it be operational?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, we've allocated the money to the department. It's our intention that the office will be set up by the end of the fiscal year.
Okay.
The member for Fort Garry.
The contingency for youth corrections reform, I'm wondering if the minister can tell us what that is and why it isn't in the justice portfolio.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this initiative is something that brought forward through Justice, and it is to set up different programming for youth corrections reform. That's a part of it. And so this office will be up and running by the end of the year.
The member for Fort Garry.
Under this section, there is another $18 million plus contingency fund that's up from the previous year. What is this contingency fund for? It seems that there's a number of staff that go along with it, and I'm wondering if you can tell us what this is all about.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so this is contingency that's notionally allocated. And this kind of is something that's happened on a yearly basis. So I'll go through maybe some examples. So the first one is, there's $10 million that's set aside for retirement or severance. It's very similar to what it was last year. So when departments are unable to allocate retirement or severance costs from their existing resources, they can request an allocation from ISA. So it's money that's held back for such things as, again, retirements or severance. There's things like employee pension and other costs. I think it's about $5 million allocated, very similar to last year. This is for the potential increase in kind of salary-related liabilities as a result of actuarial valuations and other adjustments. So, obviously you get your evaluations from your actuarials just on pension funds and that sort. So it's a bit of a contingency built in case the numbers that we get back aren't the same. There's a flex fund. So there's about 45 types of FTEs for a flex fund, which are used as a contingency for in-year staffing requirements. So, for example, 30 FTEs and 626,000 were transferred from flex funds in 2020 related to the establishment of 3 new departments as a result of the January 2000 government reorganization. So again, that's how we maybe pull some money over if there's some changes. So when Minister Gordon moved into her role, that would be there. The only difference that I would say from the funds, if the members go in there, is there's certain things that we provided. We had money for a central service scoping fund. I think it was about $4 million. So we actually put that in the department. So it's in the department's estimates as opposed to ISA. Same thing with $5 million for ICT scoping fund. Again, it was held centrally before. Now it's within the departments. And we also had last year about $20 million of unallocated dollars. That just, if things happen throughout the year. So we didn't utilize that as much because we've got so much built into other contingencies that we have laid out. So that really makes up the difference between the two funds. But so it's a kind of a centralized fund that everyone can tap into if things change throughout the year from the department level, and they kind of apply centrally for the dollars, and that's kind of based on previous years what we have done.
The member for Fort Garry.
Now, the government has allocated $40 million in enabling appropriations every year back to 2018, 2019 for the Green Fund. I wonder if the minister can tell us how much has been spent in each of those years, and can he give us, the committee, a cumulative total since 2018 of how much in total has actually been spent from the Green Fund?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I know our officials are just looking to get that information, but I do have some further information. I had mentioned that the Learning Fund, we would be able to provide the information. So in 2019 and 20, $1.1 million was allocated. So that just kind of finishes the circle, I guess, if you will. Our officials are looking for that information for the next question. So I'm going to maybe just go back on mute here till I get the answers, and then I can refer them to the
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Chair, our officials are reviewing it. They're going to be able to get the answer, but just in the essence of time, maybe we can move on. If I get the answer before we close here in 5 minutes, I'll provide it. Otherwise, I can provide it on Monday morning. We will have the answer. It's going to take a bit of time to pull up.
The member for Fort Garry.
Could the minister provide a detailed organization chart for vital statistics?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And we certainly have the 2019, it's in the annual report. So we can provide that one. If there's ability, there would be an ability, although this isn't really a enabling appropriations piece. It is more of a line department piece. I guess it's a standoff, I guess, if you will, but we would be able to provide that. I don't think we have that right now. It is available online, but we could provide that for the member.
The member for Fort Garry.
How many full-time equivalent positions are there in vital statistics, and how many are currently filled?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we will provide the information. We were prepared, obviously, and got the information for enabling appropriations. So this isn't really in that. If it's the will of the chair, of the member from Fort Garry, if he wants to re-ask the question when we get into the finance section, be more than willing to provide that information. We don't have it right in front of us right now, but maybe we could, just in the essence of time, we could maybe go on to another question and we could provide that information when we go through the finance department.
The member for Fort Garry.
Yeah, that's fair enough. The Pallister budget has budgeted about $120 million in 2020-21 to devolve a number of assets. You see it in the report.
I'd like to ask the member, when referring to, like you had mentioned, the Pallister budget, that's not really the proper, Pallister government budget. So just to keep things in line, the member for Fort Garry.
Okay. So it was budgeted last year for Northern Airports, $55 million, Manitoba Centennial Center, 35, Manitoba Habitat Heritage Corporation, 30. Northern Airports appears again this year. Manitoba Centennial Center Corp appears again this year. Were those funds actually spent? And sort of what is the status on all that?
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Yes, no, good question. So the appropriation was included in the 2020-21 to offset the accounting charges related to the devolution of 3 government assets. The devolution was only completed for one of the 3 assets in 2021-22, kind of a COVID thing. It wasn't, I want to say, it was a huge priority, but there was a lot of things going on in 2020-21, resulting in the reduction of $30 million. The remaining of the fund is being carried over to 2021. So that's $55 million for the Northern Airport and Marine. So that's negotiations, discussions with Indigenous communities and leadership. And the second is $35 million for the Manitoba Centennial Center Corporation. The devolution of the Manitoba Habitat Heritage Corporation was completed in 2020-21. Excerpts from the budget in fiscally responsible outcome and economic outlook was on page 57. So that's, I think, what the member is referring to. So some have and some haven't. And mainly the reason why they weren't is, because of everything that's going on with COVID.
The member for Fort Garry.
Does the minister anticipate that the Northern Airports and the Manitoba Centennial Center will be devolved this year? And I assume, given his comments, that those 2 entities, their combined $90 million wasn't spent last year.
The Honorable Minister of Finance.
Yeah, so we announced that with Indigenous leadership. So I understand, and I haven't been directly involved in the negotiations, but those are ongoing. So we do anticipate both of these devolution of these assets to happen in this fiscal year. Yeah.
The member for Fort Garry.
In relation to the capital investment internal service adjustment entry at 26.4, I'm just wondering if the minister can explain what these funds were for and how much actually flowed in the past year.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think the question was what we spent in 2020-21. So that's a public accounts thing that will come out obviously in September. So there was things like the resiliency piece that was a kind of agreement with municipalities and kind of the metro region, I guess, if you will, and ideas fund. So we'll be able to get some more information on that. If the member is interested in the future, like what's in the budget of the money that's associated with things like IT, ICT projects, there's 15.4 million. Waverly West Schools, 21.1 million. Unallocated was 3.6 million for total assets of 40 million. So that breaks down the capital assets of 40 million. The Ideas Fund, again, $25 million. That's for a variety of different areas. And breaking up the Restart Capital for 113 million. Highway infrastructure is about $107 million. And park infrastructure restart about 6.2 million, and restart capital programs about 113 million for a total of 178. So that kind of identifies what we're looking to spend those monies on this year.
Okay.
The member for Fort Garry.
And again, I'm just curious why it's in internal service adjustments and that they're not, put in the infrastructure budget or elsewhere, some of the education capital budget, that kind of thing.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So yeah, a lot of these are centrally funded, right? So the IDEA Fund, for instance, right, all departments could apply for this. There wasn't. The teachers had some, IDEA Fund had some money attached, but beyond it was kind of a whole government as well. So it was held centrally for that particular region. Same thing with the IT types of projects. Those are kind of centrally funded, whether you're in, infrastructure, or whether you're in department of, whatever the department is, they apply centrally for that. And the Manitoba Restart, that's kind of the, I think it's over $500 million we allocated for kind of road projects and, waterways projects. That was just allocated centrally for that. So most of them, again, were kind of highway related projects, but some were other areas. So we just held it centrally.
The member for Fort Garry.
In the 2020-2021 budget, there was $100 million for emergency expenditures. You've done that again this year.
Order. The hour being 12:30 p.m. Committee rise.